His actual given name is Kutlusha. Not a very common name today. It's based on Turkic Mongol Kutlu, meaning blessed, and Shah, king. But it seemed to be more in fashion in the 14th century than it is today. His father was a person named Amir Sarkis, probably of some sort of status, from Archesh, the town of Archesh in Kajberunik. And his mother, unfortunately, we do not have her name, but she was from the town of Parki. I have a map, and we'll look at those in a second. That's in the Adela district. We should also mention that his father had to flee Kajberunik and wound up in Vayotzor in Syunik province. So we don't have, it doesn't say exactly why, but at the time when Grigor was born, and slightly before, it was the dissolution of the Ilkhanid Empire. That is, the Mongols in Iran, about 1336, start to collapse. And what happens is a series of wars between various Turkmen tribes, particularly the Karakuyunlu and the Akuyunlu. And it's around this time that the Karakuyunlu are sort of coming together and forming themselves. And so there's a lot of warfare, and it seems that part of one of the sort of results of this was that Grigor's father and mother had to flee from Kajberunik, and they went to Syunik. Now, the sources are not clear where exactly Grigor was born. One source says it's in Vayotzor, and then he went to Georgia. And the other source says, in fact, that he was born in the fortress of Temuk, which is Temukvi in Georgian. And here's an actual picture of Temukvi. It's on the Georgia-Armenian border in the province of Gugark, and sort of goes on both sides. And they are in agreement that he was sort of raised by his brother, who worked for the Georgian king David VIII. So his brother lived in Tbilisi, in Tiflis, and it seems that Grigor was sent to him, either from Temukvi or Vayotzor, and raised in Georgia, right, in Tbilisi and its environs, in an Armenian community, but nonetheless in the Kingdom of Georgia, probably because it was more stable at that time politically. Okay, and here, I don't know if you can make anything out, but the region of Kajberunik and Archesh, as you can see, is in the northeastern, right above the northeastern part of Lake Van, right above it. Vayotzor, slightly further to the east. Temukvi, you can see underlined there, and Tbilisi to the north, both of them on the, near the Armeno-Georgian borders. I mention these because actually all of these places will have a significant impact on Grigor's life later on, as we'll see. So, as I said, he was raised in Georgia, and it seems that he spent the first 7 years of his education he started his education at the age of 7, and we presume that was with memorizing the Psalter. That was, well, I'll talk a little bit later about the education system of particularly the Armenian Church a little bit later on, but probably his early education consisted of memorizing the Psalter first and foremost. And around the age of 14, it seems that Hovhannes Voronezh came to Tbilisi. According to one Califan, he was there in order to collect works to combat Latin teachings. And again, this is something that I will talk about later on. But he met the young Kutlusha and was significantly impressed by how intelligent he was. All the accounts sort of describe him as a child prodigy, able to memorize vast amounts, and impress both his teachers there in Georgia as well as from outside with how much knowledge he had acquired. And so this Hovhannes Voronezh decides to take Grigor under his wing and complete his formal education with him. Now, Voronezh himself is an interesting character because he was the last disciple of S.A. Nechetsi. Some people may be familiar with S.A. Nechetsi. S.A. Nechetsi was the director of the famous monastic school at Glajor. If some of you may be familiar that UCLA has one of the most beautiful gospel books from the medieval period, Armenian gospel books, that's known as the Glajor Gospel because it was illuminated there. And that school, as I'll be talking about a little bit later on, was the most famous monastic school of its time, particularly under the directorship of S.A. Nechetsi, which lasted from 1284 to 1338 till his death. And Hovhannes Vodetnetsi was his last student, his last disciple. And he then moved around. He was peripatetic, went from place to place. But as we'll see, eventually he settled with with Grigor in Syunik. So this is a lovely, lovely manuscript illumination about S.A. Nechetsi teaching his students, and we can suppose that one of them there is Hovhannes Vodetnetsi. Okay, so after beginning his training with Vodetnetsi, he was ordained, and this happened actually in Jerusalem. First, he went to Erzinga, to Mount Sepu with Vodetnetsi, where he was consecrated a deacon. And here we can see that Erzinga, on the map here by Erzincan, sort of roughly halfway between Greater Armenia and the Kingdom of Cilicia, what was the Kingdom of Cilicia by this time, was almost at its end in 1371. But it was on this important trade route that went from Ayas, and then it went to Erzincan to Erzurum, and at Erzurum it split. And on the one hand it went north to Tbilisi and to Trebizond, and from there to the Crimea. And on the other line it went down south towards Tabriz, and then there was a branch that went up back into Syunik from there. And the Mount Sepu, which rests right outside of Erzincan, was a particularly important place for Armenians, because that was considered the traditional burial place of St. Grigor Lusavodic, Gregory the Illuminator. And so Armenians from all over, whether it was Cilicia or Greater Armenia, went to Mount Sepu, went to Erzincan to pay respects and to visit on pilgrimage to see the burial spot of St. Grigor Lusavodic. And so Erzincan and Mount Sepu became an important monastic complex on the route from Greater Armenia to Cilicia, or from Cilicia to Greater Armenia, but also as part of the much larger pilgrimage route that went from Greater Armenia to Erzincan to Cilicia and then down to Jerusalem. And this is precisely what Grigor and Hovhannes do. They go to Erzincan, and there he's made a deacon. They remain there for a few years, and then he goes down and they go to Jerusalem, where he's actually ordained a priest, a celibate priest in Jerusalem probably in the spring of 1373. And we know this because it's nice that we have colophons where he calls himself deacon, 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 and then all of a sudden it stops after that he's been to Jerusalem. Now he's Grigor, and he's no longer a deacon. He's no longer sacerdote. He's now a celibate priest. Okay, so that ends up his first sort of stage of education as he's ordained a celibate priest in Jerusalem. Sorry. Okay. They then, 1374, shortly after that, he receives the first rank of Vartapet. And again, this will be something that I'll be talking about later on. The first rank of Vartapet gave him permission to preach. He was able then to officially preach in the Armenian Church. And it also allowed him to teach basic courses. It didn't allow him, however, to write biblical commentaries. Okay? And it didn't allow him to actually direct any school classes. Right? So basically, it's like adjunct professor or assistant professor. It's the low level you've started off, and this is the rank you're going to start with. After further training, then you can actually move on to the next level. He seems to have done this several years later. First, they returned to Syunik, or they Vodetnetsi takes Grigor back to Syunik, and they seem to be there by 1376. And then in 1385, so you can see how long it took him, Grigor finally received the title of eminent, or Zairagun, of Vartapet. And here's a picture, this is a beautiful illumination also, of Hovhannes Vodetnetsi in Grigor Tat'ewac'i when Grigor was still a student. You can see he sort of has his vehard, his office head in Vodetnetsi's on. You can also see that the vehard had a different shape at those times. It didn't quite have the triangle shape. It had more of an onion shape, particularly in the 14th century, at least judging by manuscript illuminations. So by 1385, it seems that Grigor has reached the top of the educational ladder. He has his PhD, so to say. man. In 1386, his teacher, Vodonetsi, dies. Grigor moves around a bit and finally establishes himself at the monastery of Tatev in 1391, where he's quickly recognized as the chief Vartapet, the most renowned teacher of all of Armenia. And he gets that actual title, Chief Vartapet of Armenia. Right? And then he remains as head of the school until 1408, okay, when he's forced to flee, and I'll talk about that in a second. So he's able to teach there fairly consistently from 1391 to 1408, and hence he's given the name Tat'ewac'i, since he spent most of his career there. In 1408, he's forced to flee. Again, it doesn't say why. His student Tovma Medzopitsi, who had been studying with him for 2 years at that point, says that they were forced to flee from Tatev and they go back to Kajberunik because of persecutions from the infidel. We don't know whom actually, whether it was Tamerlane's sons or whether it was local Turkmen who persecuted them. He isn't clear about that. But for some reason, they felt that they couldn't remain at Tatev anymore, and they decided to go back to Medzop, the monastery of Medzop, which is also near Archesh, north of Lake Van, and Kajberunik. And in 1409, after being there for almost a year, Tat'ewac'i, this is a very interesting story. One account says he dies peacefully. He goes back to Tatev and he dies peacefully. However, Tovma Medzopetsi also has this very strange account that some of Tat'ewac'i's other students come and steal him. And they're trying to bring him back to Syunik. But somewhere along the way in Ayderdat province, his other students from Medzop catch up to them, and they're fighting over who should be able to keep him. And while they're doing that, he dies. And so he dies on the road back to Syunik. Again, Medzopetsi is very, very laconic about this. He doesn't go into complete details. Obviously, this is not something he really wants to talk about. But there is then a cleaned up version that he goes back to Syunik to die there. And that's where his mausoleum is to this day. And you can go and there's that nice mausoleum there, and there are nice inscriptions around there talking about Grigor Tat'ewac'i, and that's at the monastery of Tatev. If anyone's been there, you can still see that. Okay, so that's his life. Salient features of this life for me are that, one, he lived a life basically on the road. Right? Throughout his life, he was moving, whether it was from his early childhood in which his parents were forced to move on repeated occasions. He seems to have been forced to move to Georgia because of the political situation. He then moves along with Vodonetsi all around the region, from Georgia down to Syunik, over to Erzinga, down to Jerusalem, back to Syunik, all around in Syunik. In fact, one year when he returned to Syunik, he had to spend it cooped up in a fortress because it was being besieged, and they almost starved to death, but they managed to make it out. So he was moving around a lot. Likewise, he had connections with many places because of this. And I think this is important. I listed some of them. Kajberunik at the north of Lake Van, to Georgia, to Mount Sepu, and to Jerusalem, at least in addition to Syunik and Tatev. This gives him a unique perspective. This is not somebody who never left the wall of a monastery and only looked at a book. This is somebody who had seen the world, had seen very problematic events in the world. Right? One of which, I mean, obviously, were the political situation of the instability. The other one is that he met Armenians from all over the dispersion of that time. And that was also very important. It gave him a much broader perspective than we would assume. Likewise, having his father come from Archesh meant that his father actually was born under excommunication. And this is something that I'll talk about, because Archesh at that time was under the jurisdiction of the Catholicosate of Akhtamar, which had been a schismatic Catholicosate from the beginning of the 12th century. And so the Catholicosate at this time did not actually recognize people born under the jurisdiction of Akhtamar. And Grigor, as we'll see later, does take a role in this controversy. And he says, look, I want to resolve this because it's a matter of personal injury to me. My father was born under excommunication. Okay, so he knows what it means. The problems of the Armenian Church for him are not theoretical, right? They're personal, and that's what he says. And you can see that personal investment that he has in all of his works in the success of the Armenian Church for him, right? And in the unity of the Armenian people. Because he really is a result of the political instability and of the religious instability of the time. And finally, we have to say that he's associated with the Glajor school, which is also very important. That puts him in the most highly regarded and, let's say, the most advanced intellectual tradition in Armenia at the time. And I'm going to talk more about that tradition because it's more than just Glajor. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the 13th century. So it puts him in a historical continuity as well. Okay. So those are just some things I'd like to point out now about his life. Let's look at some of his work and activity. He's mainly known as an author, which is what most people remember him for. And he composed over 20 works. He penned over 20 works, including biblical and commentaries on Aristotelian works of logic, commentary on scribal art, commentary actually on the Gnostic. There's a commentary attributed to him, at least in the manuscript catalogs, attributed to him on Grigor Tat'ewac'i. He also wrote seminary, two-volume seminary, a summer and winter volume. We have liturgical tractates by him, as well as several letters, and his most famous works, right, I would say, are his two theological compilations, one being the Grigor Tat'ewac'i, the Book of Questions, and the other one being the Voskaborik, which is more centered on the New Testament. And I'll be talking about the Grigor Tat'ewac'i a little bit later on this evening. This is, by the way, the title page from the winter volume of this seminary that was published in Constantinople in 1740. And so, again, a little preview here. His works continue to have an impact on the Armenian Church 340 years later, when they're printed 350 years later, as we're getting to the dawn of modernity. And these works do not remain in manuscript form, but come out in printed versions fairly quickly in the 18th century. Okay. You say his first job as a vartapet and as a deacon, actually, even before a vartapet as a deacon, was that of a scribe at the Bish. He copied manuscripts, and a lot of the information, as I said, that I have about him is from his own colophons. Here, this is something, obviously, this is Grigor Tat'ewac'i. It's the autograph. We're very, very lucky to have this. That means this is his copy. The one that he wrote himself in 1397. It's in the Modernization. This is an open folio from it. You can possibly tell. I mean, he was a scribe. His handwriting was not particularly good. I have to say, I've seen much better hands in Armenian, but nonetheless, he wrote a lot, so maybe he wrote quickly. Nonetheless, we do have his autograph, which is great. I'll be talking. We'll see this a little bit later again as well, but this is the first page from the third volume of the Grigor Tat'ewac'i. He was also a manuscript illuminator. Most people are not familiar with his illuminations, but there has been a work published on him, and he actually wrote his name. We know it's him because he actually wrote his name into a couple of them, and here it says that this painting was, this illumination was painted by Grigor, the servant of the Logos, who was the disciple of Hovannes Voronetsi. So we know that it was him, and this is of the Annunciation, the visit of the angel to the Virgin Mary. It's interesting, the style of his painting doesn't, even though he's in the Glajor intellectual tradition, the style of his painting is from the Modernization school. And something I mentioned in my thesis and haven't had time to really follow up upon, but there must have been cross-fertilization, at least in terms of the manuscript illuminations between the Glajor tradition and that of Modernization, and its most famous representative, Momik. Some people may not have heard of Momik, who's also a sculptor as well. And he was a musicologist, something else most people don't realize. Obviously, singing, very important in the Armenian Church. One of the first things that students have to learn, and I say memorizing the Psalter, it's not just memorizing words, it's memorizing the tunes, right? Memorizing the shadagans as well. And this was an important part of a monk's education. and it was a very important part of Grigor's life as well. And it's actually, he did the final cut for what should be in the Shattuck notes that's used in the Armenian Church. He went through and decided who, he ascribed a lot of the attributions, that is, these are by Nerses Shnorhali, these are by Mesor Mashtots, these are by this person, these are by that person, and he basically made, he's the last person until the modern period to actually go through and make a cut and say, these are the Shattagons that we're going to use, and this is the compilation of the Shattuck notes, the hymnal. And there's an example of a hymnal from the 14th or 15th century. And finally, he was a teacher. And again, something that's overlooked when people are talking about Tat'ewac'i, because we're aware of his works and his productivity. One of the things that really struck me early on was how much his students loved him. Being a teacher and having been a student, that's not always a given. Right? You always have plenty of professors like, all right, they're bright, but I don't really want to spend the rest of my life with them. He had a cult following. I mean, people came, as we'll see, from all over to study with him. And here's Topma Menzobetsi writing about him, saying sometimes he would hand out bread during his lessons, sometimes he would hand out apples, right? And people said, those who saw him said, this is what it must have been like for the disciples to have been studying at the feet of Christ. Now, that's a lot of praise for, to give a teacher. And he himself had a very interesting pedagogical technique. In one of his commentaries, he makes a comparison between Eve and Mary. And this is a common comparison, obviously, between the two. And the comparison is that when Satan comes to Eve and says, eat of the apple, she just takes and eats it. When the angel comes to Mary and says, you're going to give birth to God, she says, whoa, wait a second. Who are you? Where did this come from? You know, she doesn't jump at it and say, oh, great, and accept it. She questions. And then he goes on to a lengthy discussion saying, because she's the ideal student. This is already interesting that for a medieval Armenian monk to hold up a woman as the ideal student within a monastic school. But he says, Mary is the ideal of what a student should be. Receptive, listening, but questioning. Right? Not just following orders, but questioning what they're being told, even if it's by an angel, right? So that they properly understand what's going on. And this is something else we'll look into, this whole issue of the question and answer genre, obviously, which he used almost exclusively. This is, again, a famous picture of Grigor Tat'ewac'i himself with his students around him. And notice, this is from Kaffa in the Crimea, this manuscript. And his reputation, along with his students, traveled. And again, we'll look at that in a minute as well. Okay. We also have political activity. Right? One of the interesting things is that both his teacher, Modernization, and Grigor himself, right, seem to have assumed episcopal powers. That is, there is no evidence whatsoever that either one of them were ever consecrated a bishop. Right? There's nowhere that it says they don't say they're a bishop, nobody else calls them a bishop. However, when the monastery of Tatev in the 18th century came up with its list of bishops and leading Vardapets, it lists Voronezhi as the first one and Grigor as the second one, and lists them as bishops, which is interesting. Again, there doesn't seem to be any evidence of this, that they were ordained. But they did take on episcopal powers, and that's something that the head of the school of Tatev at this point seems to be able to do. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And I should also note that Tat'ewac'i himself was able to get his nephew, Arakel, actually ordained as bishop and installed at Tatev. So it's clear that he himself wasn't a bishop, because while he was alive, he had his nephew made a bishop. In order to, so that we actually don't know who was the bishop of Syunik at this time, while they were there. So they seem to have taken on that role. And we see this particularly with such things as their anti-unitor activity. Now, some of you may be familiar with the unitors. The unitors were Armenians who fell in love, I'm going to say intellectually particularly, with the Roman Catholic Church. One of the founder of the movement, Paco Kurgnetsi, was actually another student of S.A. Nechetsi at Glajor. He met a Roman Catholic missionary, liked what he heard, and decided, you know what, these guys have the way to the future. And he started, another interesting story, they say when he and his followers first met the Roman Catholics, the Roman Catholics were not originally sent out to be converting Armenians. They were out to go to Iran and convert, we don't know whom, but possibly Persians. They found out that it wasn't very easy to convert non-Christians to Christianity if you wanted to keep your head on your shoulders. So they said, why should we do that? We have Christians here we can convert to Christianity, right? That's a little bit easier. So, but they say they didn't know Armenian because they weren't being sent out there to meet Armenians. But they're like, okay, these people are here. And the Armenians didn't know Latin, obviously. So how did they communicate with each other? And we have the translator of a lot of these texts, known as another Hako, Tarkman, the translator. He says, we use Persian. And this is actually quite astounding. They use Persian to communicate with each other. Okay, on a daily basis, I can see Armenians are using Persian all the time. And the Catholic missionaries also learn Persian for conversion purposes. So they're able to speak that. What still gets me, however, is how these Latin theological texts that they translated, talking about the Trinity, talking about the ineffability of God, talking about church doctrine, how they found the Persian terms to be able to accurately translate them from Latin to Armenian. And having read the Armenian versions of these Latin texts and compared them to Latin, they did a great job. And, you know, talking about the Trinity is difficult and the Incarnation is difficult in the best of circumstances. And I can't imagine trying to do it via Persian. And one day, I'd love to, I mean, we don't have a Persian text, they did it orally, but, you know, I've always wanted, at least in my imagination, to be able to reconstruct the Persian intermediary that they used. Eventually, the Armenians learned Latin, right? Because normally, the Latins didn't learn Armenian, they learned a little bit. Some of them learned, but the Armenians learned Latin and they were able to do the translations much more quickly. But at first, somebody would read it out in Latin, would read out Persian translations, the Armenians would listen to Persian and then translate it into Armenian. And they did a number of texts that way. But by 1330, they had decided in favor of union with Rome. That was eventually accepted in 1356 by the papacy. And starting again in the 1360s, 1370s, their popularity began to rise. We're talking about thousands of people following this movement. And the Armenian Church was really worried, particularly the Armenian Church in Syunik. They had already been worried from the beginning of the 14th century. One of my favorite quotes is from Stepanos Orbelian. When confronted with this issue, he was saying, "Oh my God, it's a plague. All of Cilicia is already infected with this Catholic plague, and now it's come to us." And he said, "I'd rather go to hell with my ancestors than to heaven with the Romans." So I mean, which is like a good stance to take in this offensive. And S.A. Nechetzi also addressed this issue, and he said, "Look, if they're Christian, if they come to your house, take them in. If they come to your monastery, take them in. If they start discussing theology with you and try to convert you, kick them out. They're not coming as Christians, they're coming as wolves in sheep's clothing." All right, so he's like, be friendly to them, but don't start any of these discussions. It seemed to have subsided a little bit, but again, there was a resurgence of unitor activity in the 1360s and 70s, and the apostolic leadership in Syunik in particular was perturbed. And one of Vodonetzi's students, Marakia Horenetzi, he was from the Crimea, from Kaffa. This is somebody that everybody in the church really loves. He was the son of a very wealthy merchant and decided after pilgrimage to Jerusalem to devote all of his money to the church. And he devoted it to combating unitor influence. And they set up an ad hoc inquisition, basically. Now there was no authority for this. I mean, that is, they didn't write to Cilicia, they didn't write to the Catholicos and say, "Can we do this?" They just did it. And they went from monastery to monastery. And they questioned the Armenian monks. They don't seem to have touched the missionaries themselves. But the Armenians who may have converted, they confronted them and drilled them to see if they had become infected with this sort of Latinizing tendency. And they were quite stringent. They beat them up, they put them into prison. Sometimes they called in local princes to imprison them. My favorite one was that three of them were brought to Vodonetzi and Tat'ewac'i, and they were encouraged to give up this Latinization. And they said, "No, we're not going to do it." So they boiled them alive. And the Colophon says, "And we melted them down." And that was that. It then goes on to say in a very interesting way, but the books that they had translated were very interesting. And the seminary was sermons of Augustine. And they said, that was very useful. So they kept the books. It's sort of the opposite of the book burning. So they burned the people, they kept the books. Right? They took it out on the messenger, not the message. But that, and so this was a big deal. But again, as I said, they don't seem to have had any ecclesiastical oversight. They did this on their own. It was self-supported and it was locally run. So that's one example where they seem to have taken over what would normally be the jurisdiction of a bishop to be able to do that sort of thing. But they didn't have any episcopal oversight for that. Likewise, in the Achtamar controversy that I mentioned, Grigor Tat'ewac'i inserted himself into this controversy between the Catholicosate of Sis and the Catholicosate of Achtamar, and he wrote several letters to both parties. As I said, he tried to put an end to this because he said, one, it's very personal for me. My father was born under excommunication, and I want that excommunication lifted. Two, he said, this is hurting the Armenian Church because we're in schism, and that means we're weakened. And three, what's interesting, what he said was that, look, at first, Sis was correct, or the Catholicosate in Cilicia was correct. Achtamar was schismatic, right? and should not have come about at the beginning of the 12th century. On the other hand, he says, because of the policies, the pro-Latin policies that the Catholicosate in Cilicia has undertaken, right? Now Achtamar is correct, theologically, and that they've added fuel to the fire, or let's say that the behavior of the Catholicosate in Sis has sort of justified the reasons of the existence of the Catholicosate of Achtamar. And so he's trying to mediate between these two. He wasn't successful, obviously, in solving that schism, but it is interesting to note that it was his students, including Toma Mezzopizi, that headed up the movement to bring the Catholicosate back to Armenia and to put it at Echmiadzin. Right? So it's under his sort of guidance, they realized that the only way to heal the Armenian Church was to sort of get rid of these. It didn't work again, retain the schism to this day, but nonetheless, not full schism, but at least the multiple Catholicosates. But nonetheless, they saw that the one way of bringing all Armenians together was to make the church in Armenia, in Echmiadzin, in Vaharshabat. So that was the direct influence of this controversy and the Grigor Tat'ewac'i. And again, one of the ways that he did have an impact on the later development of the church. And then finally, you can say he acted again in a role that's normally accorded to bishops as a diplomat. And in particular with Tamerlane's son, Miran Shah. And he writes about this too, and he says, look, you realize, he's writing about some other issue, but he says, look, you realize how many times I've interceded on the behalf of our fellow Christians who have been imprisoned by Tamerlane and his sons, by the infidels, and I've gotten them released. Right? And so he seems to have had a good rapport, in particular, with Miran Shah, and was able to get certain benefits for the Armenian Christians in Sunni sporadically. Of course, this was all, 1 month yes, 1 month no, but nonetheless, again, he served in a role that's traditionally done by a bishop. So all of these things have led me to conclude that they sort of took on, if not officially, right, de facto, if not de jure, the role of bishop of Sunni in some ways, purely by force of personality and force of intellect. Because everybody looked to the head of the school of Tatev now as sort of as the guiding light for the Armenian Church, at least in Sunni, not from elsewhere. Now, part of the reason why they were able to do this is because of the reforms they instituted. And I'm going to say it was actually, as I mentioned, they were part of the Glajor-Tat'ew tradition. Right? It's a long tradition. So before I can talk about the reforms, I want to talk about the tradition they were part of. It actually goes back to Mechitar Gosh. People may be familiar with him. He wrote the first law code in Armenian, in which he also established rules for the rank of orthoped. But Grigor Tat'ewac'i himself, in one of his colophons, traces back his own intellectual lineage to Mechitar Gosh. And so it goes from Mechitar Gosh to Vanadan Vartapet, to Vartan Aravelsi, and then we get to the Gladzor period with Nerses Mishitsi and S.A. Nechitsi, and then finally the Tatev period with Hovanes Vorodnetsi and Grigor Tat'ewac'i. And so you can see that this, I argue, is an entire tradition. We're not talking about different schools. They move physically, but intellectually they form a whole. The other thing that's interesting about this, and that I'll talk about a little bit later on as well, is that Mechitar Gosh is living, obviously, after the collapse of the Babylonian Artsruni kingdoms, after the collapse of Byzantine power in the east, and during a rather unstable time with the Turkish invasions of the Seljuks at the end of the 12th century, as well. They're coming at the end of the 11th century, but throughout the 12th century, it's under Seljuk and various Turkic emirates throughout Armenia. Also, the monastic system suffered. There wasn't, the church hierarchy had removed itself to Cilicia. Things are in disarray. And what happened was that Mechitar Gosh, as well as Vartan Tat'ewac'i, both traveled to Cilicia to finish their education and then come back to Armenia. Okay? And we see this early on, the direction of learning is that you go from Greater Armenia to Cilicia and then come back. By the time we get to the school at Tatev, it's going from Cilicia to Tatev and then going back. And we see a complete reversal. And I'll talk about this a little while on as well. But this is the entire, I would say, sort of tradition as it sort of evolves. Now, as we know from the school at Glajor, but also at Tatev, there were 3 faculties to the school. Music, as I said, very, very important for everybody. Painting or illumination. Right, that seems to have been a second faculty. And then the most important faculty was the exegetical faculty. That was sort of the academic one, the one that worried about producing biblical commentaries, producing commentaries on secular works as well, or at least logic and patristic works. We'll talk about this. As we can see, they had 2 different types. They had the external works, artaki, which were profane literature, or for example, Philo, Aristotle. It's unclear exactly what was included in that. Also some meteorological texts, mathematical texts, geographies, that sort of work. And then the more important one, the nerki, the internal ones, right? The religious literature. And this was obviously the Bible first and foremost, but also patristic literature and spiritual literature as well. Now, your course of studies pretty much was basically the same that we know for most of the, over the 200 years of the school. However, there were some changes. As I mentioned, the primary education basically was about learning the Psalter and liturgical hymns. You had to memorize the Book of Psalms and the Shadagans. That was your basic. Probably learned how to write as well at a very rudimentary level, which would then pick up as you move, as you progressed, and if you were going to go into the academic side of things, you'd become a scribe. But more importantly, for the rank of Vartabed, or to be a teacher, this was prescribed by Mechitar Gosh in his law code from around 1184, and this seems to have stayed the way it was for most of the existence of the schools. And so you had to know, he said, you have to know the Old and New Testaments. Good idea if you're going to be in the church. So you had to know the Old and New Testaments. You had to know how to preach. Interesting. They put an emphasis on your ability to preach. Okay, that you had to be able to connect to people. Canon law. You had to know canon law as well. You know, again, nothing extraordinary. And you had to take an exam that was administered by 2 or 3 other Vartabeds. Right? So people who already at the rank gave you an exam. Okay? We also have indications that you probably had to know certain teachings of Armenian church fathers as well as non-Armenian church fathers, patristics to some degree. And it also seems we have indications, at least at the Glajor level, we know for sure, that you had to give a final oration. We have a copy of one of these, where you had to stand in front of a jury and deliver an oration on a certain topic. So we also had that as well. And here you can see a picture of Goshavan, a very beautiful monastery to this day in the Republic of Armenia. Now, the reforms. Both Grigor and Tat'ewac'i reformed the system. The first series of reforms, and they were both substantial and formal. That is, they actually changed what was learned, and they sort of changed the ritual around it. And the first step is that there was the creation of 2 levels of Vartabed. I've already mentioned that Grigor did this. He had the lower one that's just plain Vartabed, and then he got the Tzaidaguin, the eminent Vartabed. So they created those 2 ranks. Now, we're not exactly certain whether, it seems that ordinance is the first to establish clearly two ranks. There do seem to be different ranks of Vartapets earlier. We know of Rabunapet, Varjapet, Vartapet, but we're not quite certain whether these were actually different ranks or just different names and different from region to region. We are clear that after this there are these two ranks that are given to teachers in the church. And as I said, the lower one allowed you to preach and probably head up a class, or at least give basic lessons. And the second one would allow you to direct the class and also to write commentaries. All right, so we can see that there's a desire here to elevate the standard. Right, you can't just walk around saying I'm a Vartapet because I'm still a priest or something like that. You had to show that you had a degree of intellectual training. All right, and this became very important. Now, one of the things they did establish, and I'm almost certain it was Modernization who established this, is a course of studies in logic between the two ranks. And I know this because it happens in Grigor's studies. You can trace the works he did himself. We can see that after he completed the first rank of Vartapet, right, in between that and his reception of the second rank of Vartapet, of Zaydagui Vartapet, he wrote school commentaries on the Aristotelian tractates, the Categories, and the De Interpretatione, as well as the pseudo-Aristotelian De Virtutibus on the virtues. It was attributed to Aristotle, but wasn't by him. And as well as Porphyry's Isagoge, or Introduction to the Aristotelian works. Okay? These texts have been translated into Armenian a long time ago, between the 5th and 6th centuries. And they'd always been there. But they weren't part of the formal education system. They were in fashion in the 7th century, but then they seemed to fall out of fashion. They come back in at this time as well, and along with David Anhach, David the Invincible Philosopher, and his works. So Tat'ewac'i, in between his first level and second level, writes commentaries on this work. And as I said, after completing this series of commentaries, right, he was then able to move on to biblical works. And that's the point when he becomes Zaydagui Vartapet. Right? He gets the rank of Zaydagui Vartapet upon the completion of his first biblical commentary, which is on Isaiah in 1384, and he receives the title in 1385. Okay, so that's his PhD thesis in some ways. What's interesting is to compare this course of studies to the Logica Vetus. Now, the Logica Vetus was employed by the Dominicans to train their novitiates, and it consisted of Aristotle's Categories and De Interpretatione, Gilbert de la Porre's Liber de Sex Principii, and Porphyry's Isagoge. We notice that they're exactly the same, except for the Gilbert de la Porre's Liber de Sex Principii, right, Book of Six Principles. And we can understand why. As an Armenian apostolic, you're not necessarily wanting to use a Latin text as part of your course of study. So they just switched out and put in another, what they thought was another Aristotelian text in there. Now, as I said, this was prescribed by the Dominicans, and it was adopted by the Unitors in 1344. So there's no doubt in my mind that Modernization, who, by the way, commissioned also a complete manuscript, we have one manuscript in the Matanadaran that he commissioned that includes all of these texts, including Gilbert's text, the Armenian translation of that, for him to look over, that he said, wait a second, they've got something going here. We can use this for our own education system, and sort of altered it so that it was acceptable for the Armenian Apostolic Church. Having said, as I mentioned though, none of those texts, were foreign to the Armenian tradition. It was the idea of, however, making it a formal course of study that they thought they could use, but they already had all of those texts in the Armenian tradition. Now, it was Tat'ewac'i, however, who ritualized this. He took those forms, right, and then he formalized them and institutionalized them. Okay, so he created a rite of 14 degrees of Vartapet. The first 4 are the lesser, the pulchre, or particular, masnavot, right, degrees, and then the second 10 are the greater, or eminent, meds, or tzayda degrees. These are still in the mashtots to this day, the meds mashtots. There are slight differences between the minor mashtots and the meds mashtots, but that's okay. The 4 and 10 still stay. So he's the one who decided, okay, this is the course of studies I went through. Let's make this the standard, right? It's not just going to be for our school. It's not just going to be for me. Right? This is not just something that Modernization gave me. It's something we can make the standard ritual for every single person who wants to become a Vartavet in the Armenian Church. Right? And it took time, but eventually it did become the standard that's in place. All right. So there were forms of the monastic education system. Now let's look at the systematization of Armenian doctrine and the genre of question and answer. As I said, the Armenian tradition, by the time you get to Tat'ewac'i in the 1390s, 1380s, 1390s, there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of stuff out there. And if any of you ever have a chance to look at a medieval manuscript, you wind up banging your head. You really do, because it's just a lot of stuff in one book that you have to go through. And it's very complicated. But you're talking about, at this point, not only do you have the entire classical tradition from the 5th century all the way through the Bagratouni era, but now you have two different intellectual traditions, the one going on in Cilicia and the one going on in Greater Armenia. Yes, they're connected, right? But you're talking about, you have to know Mechitar Gosh, Vartan Aravensi, Vanadan Vartate, Ese Necheti, Ovanes Vodanetsi, and then Nerses Lambornetsi, Nerses Schnorali. I mean, that's a lot of stuff. And not all of it's cohesive, right? They have disagreements. There are different opinions on things. And because there wasn't a centralization of the Armenian Church, it was unclear what was correct. And the students are confused. It's clear they're confused. They don't know what the answer is. And then, students want answers because they're going to be examined. They want to get the correct answer. Right? So one of the things that Tat'ewac'i does is systematize Armenian doctrine. And this became very important. And it's important also that he uses this, go back to this, the genre of question and answer. Again, we have from the 5th century Armenian texts that have the question and answer genre. It's not particularly exciting to us, I have to say. The question is, why are there 3 persons in the Trinity? Answer, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It goes on and on. Every single work he wrote is in that side, including the sermons in the sermonary. They start off with a question, 10 reasons, 15 reasons, 3 reasons. Most people are, by reason number 2, everyone's yawning. The people, however, of the day thought it was amazing. They really did. They thought it was amazing, and they copied it. So I said the Book of Questions is the first. The Book of Questions is the first handbook of systematic theology. I'll look at this in a second. It used a table of contents. This is genius. Here we are. That's his autograph in 1397, right? That's the beginning of volume 3, and it says in chapter 1, this is what we're talking about. You can see Ike in the top there, and it says pen, and it says Yin Da, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and what it's going to be. You don't know what a God sentence is until you've looked at a medieval Armenian manuscript, like I said. You have no idea what's in there. You open the cover, and it's just words. You have no idea. Sermon, what kind of text? Is it a Greek patristic text that has been translated? There are no indications. Right? That's not the way they learn. He came up with a different idea. Again, this seems to have been based on the experience of Latin texts that did the same thing. But he realized, wow, this is a technological innovation we can use. Let's give a list of what's in our text. So the student can go, oh, look, I need to go there. At the beginning of the Grigor-Tat'ewac'i, unfortunately, the beginning of the autograph is missing. We don't have the first 2 books, the first 2 volumes. There was a Metzdesign, the complete list of everything that's going to be in the volume, in the book, so that you can go to it and find it. To this day, it's a mixed blessing, actually. To this day, people, when they want to find out an answer to a question, will look in the index. Right? As everyone does, right? In the books today, you go in the index, find out what you need, and you turn to that page number. And they do the same thing with the Grigor-Tat'ewac'i to this day. The problem is, even though Tat'ewac'i did want it to be useful in that way, what happens is you take then what he says out of context. And a lot of people just go to that one particular place and then give the answer, but don't look at the entire surrounding piece around it, and sometimes the full answer to the question, you really need to read around it as well. But nonetheless, it made life a lot easier. And really, it gave a sense of order and of structure to the entire universe for these people. Because you have to remember, right, and this is something that's very important, right? These are believing Christians. What is God for a believing Christian? Good. What is the creation? Good. Right? If you're an Armenian in the 14th century, that's very difficult to see. Your village was probably burnt down. Your parents were probably killed. You're probably on the run. You're probably starving half the time. What the heck is so good about this? There's the answer. Right? Where is the order? You got to remember, these people are living in every month there's a new ruler. Right? The Armenian Church is in complete disarray. Right? The ecclesiastic, one of them is going off talking to Rome. The other one is sitting off on an island in the middle of Lake Van. Nothing seems to be working. Nothing seems to be functioning. Right? Where is the order in the universe that is implicit in the Bible? Tat'ewac'i gives it to you. It's there. You ask the questions, you'll get the answers. And his structure, this methodical, which to us is boring in some ways, but for them it's I can see the pattern. Right? It's almost like a coding. The way we code today. Right? It may not seem exciting to someone to see 0 and 1s all over the place, but the entire structure of our universe is dependent upon it now. And you can see this, and we'll see it in a second. This, he really makes it also easy to access. So key to us today, right? Because it's a long and varied tradition, but now you don't need to go to 18 different books to find your answer. You don't have to go to a monastery all the way over there to get the one text that you don't have. It's here. It's in the Book of Questions. It's in his works. He's systematized all of it, so you know. And here we can see it right here. Here's the table, the 10 volumes that comprise the entire Book of Questions. Okay, so it starts off with polemics against non-Christian beliefs, even those that weren't around. Also one against Judaism, which is 2 pages long. The one against Islam, much longer. It's about 30 pages long, but it was taken out. The published edition, so that the Ottoman authorities wouldn't get annoyed, so they didn't publish it when they printed the text. The third one is on Trinitarian theology. Then the fourth one is on the 6 days of creation. Then we get the creation of man. Then we have a commentary on the 5 books of Moses. Then Joshua through Kings. And a commentary in the New Testament. A commentary in church hierarchy and sacramental theology. And then finally the end of the world and resurrection. He gives you an entire plan of the universe as, from a faithful Christian of the day, for his readers. It all makes sense. We can see what it means from the beginning all the way to the end. And it's also very important, he's not the only one who have written such a theological compilation. There are other people who did, particularly in the West, and he knew of them, but also in Syriac. But none of them follow this order. This is his unique order, this entire compilation. I've not been able to find an exact he does borrow from other texts in his work, but I have not found another text that does exactly in this order. And what's important here, I think, is that it's very historically based. Right? You can see there's a progression through time, right? Especially after you get after the first 3, but from 4, the first days of creation, creation of man, through the Old Testament into the New Testament, the church today, and the end of the world. And so we have this sort of historical movement through time, showing his students, look, there is an order, there is a pattern. It's not as chaotic as it seems. In doing so, he also introduced new interpretive traditions. So as I've already hinted at, on the one hand, he is presenting Armenian tradition and making it more accessible. On the other hand, he is introducing new things. One of the interesting aspects of the anti-unitor movement, of the anti-Latin movement in Armenia, was that it was not closed-minded. They realized that the Latin Church had some advantages. They said, your beliefs are wrong. Christmas is January 6th, not December 25th. There's no water added to communion. Right? There's only one incarnated nature of the Logos. However, you have a pretty impressive Aristotelian tradition, and you have some good ideas on certain things. For example, indexes and tables of content. So these things, they said, well, we can use these even if we reject what's wrong. And this, again, is a very good Armenian tradition. Petros Getadards, I think it was, once said, a Greek, this is back in the 11th century, a Greek disagreed with him on some issue, saying, you guys don't know what's in the Bible. And he said, oh, hold on, wait a second. I read Greek, or Armenians read Greek, Armenians read Latin, Armenians read Syriac. We've read through all of your crap to find the pearl. None of you can read Armenian, so you have no idea what we're talking about. So just keep quiet. But we know all of your stuff, and we just find the pearl that's hidden amongst all your junk. But he actually uses the word for sheep manure. Okay. So I mean, that's that idea. Tat'ewac'i, again, is in this tradition. Okay, we'll go through all of their stuff. We'll read their stuff and we'll find what's good. And we'll use it. Right? There's nothing wrong with that. So, as I said, the success of the unitors was problematic to the Armenian Apostolic Church. And that Aristotelian tradition in particular was very attractive. Right? And we see that a lot of the works translated, if not were by Aristotle himself, were by Latin authors of the Middle Ages who were part of the Aristotelian tradition in Europe. Right? And as I mentioned, there was an inquisition to root out the converts. But at the same time, right, those converts had translated many Latin texts that were then read in the apostolic tradition. They redid translations of Aristotle, of the works that the Armenians already had translated from Greek. Now they did another translation from Latin. They also added the analytics that they didn't have from the prior tradition. And they also translated Latin commentaries on Aristotle. They also translated theological compilations, the big three, Honorius of Aton, and then Hugh Riplin, and Thomas Aquinas. Okay, those are just three of probably the most that were translated into Armenian and had an impact. And we can see that Tat'ewac'i integrated many of these things into his own work. He doesn't necessarily say he's doing that. He doesn't say this is from Thomas Aquinas or this is from Honorius of Aton. But I've been able to find verbatim parallels between Honorius of Aton and the Elucidarium and Tat'ewac'i, as well as Hugh Riplin's work has a lot. The Book of Questions has a lot in there. And here's that's a manuscript from 1470 of Riplin's text. Porketis de Salveticis. This is one of the more interesting texts that I happened to find. How that made it to Armenia, I don't really know, but the Dominican missionaries probably brought it with them. This was a small booklet against Judaism. It's part of a larger story. The actual text, the origin was the Pugio Fide of Raymond Martini, which was huge polemic against Judaism and against Islam. And it was innovative because it used actual citations from the Talmud. It used citations from the Quran. They actually did it in fonts, so there was Arabic and Hebrew in the actual text, along with the Latin transcription and translation. It was quite a thorough text, but it was really large and was not very useful for missionaries because it was too heavy to carry around. So they created smaller excerpted versions of it, and this Porketis did one, and that one seems to have made it to Armenia and been the basis of the polemic against Judaism that Tat'ewac'i has in the Book of Questions. We also have Bartholomew of Poggio. His sermons have made their way into, some of his sermons or parts of his sermons have made their way into Tat'ewac'i's seminary. He was one of the actual original missionaries that converted unitors. And then there's citations in the Book of Questions from Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and Bonaventura. Again, not all attributed. Sometimes he does say Augustinos, but he doesn't actually explicitly cite Thomas Aquinas. But there are parallels between the two. And it has been argued that his sacramental theology was based on that of Thomas Aquinas as well. But he's always cautious not to contradict Armenian theology. He doesn't just wholesale copy things. He recontextualizes them. And one of my favorite examples has to do with Honorius of Aton, and it comes from volume 3, where he's talking about the nature of the Trinity. And you can see he's following Honorius of Aton question after question, except there's one question in which Honorius answers that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. This is known as filioque in Latin. The position of that theological argument was rejected by both the Greek Orthodox Church and by the Armenian Apostolic Church. That it's not that the Holy Spirit does not proceed from the Father and the Son, but it proceeds from the Father and through the Son within the economy of the Incarnation. So rather than copying word for word Father and Son, he cuts that out. So he's very aware that, look, our theological tradition does not accept it, so he doesn't include that. But he does include other things that he thought was that he thought were useful. So we can see that it's not just a simple-minded cut and paste, but a thoughtful reapplication, right, of other theological arguments that he felt could be useful to the Armenian Church. Okay. last thing I want to talk about here is the formation of an intellectual network. This is a little bit more complicated in some ways. As I mentioned already, in the 12th to 13th century, Cilicia was by far the center of Armenian intellectual life. This is where the innovations and the thinking were going on in Armenian monasteries. Greater Armenia was playing catch-up, having suffered from political instability. But scholars from Greater Armenia traveled to Cilicia in order to learn, and then came back to Armenia and started to reform the monastic life in Armenia itself, and as I said, started this Glajor, in its pre-Glajor phase, tradition, intellectual tradition, but it was peripatetic. It moved from place to place. We can notice, however, that over the course of the 13th century, that there's a shift. Part of this has to do with the Mongol invasions and the economic situation under the Mongol Empire. Under what they call the Pax Mongolica, the peace of the Mongols, the economic prosperity of Greater Armenia starts to come up. And we can see a shift in sort of intellectual production moving away from Cilicia to Greater Armenia over the course. It's slow, it's gradual, but it starts to happen. And Erzinga is quite important on that road. And remember, I talked about that at the beginning. Erzinga becomes a very important scribal center where the traditions of Cilicia and of Greater Armenia mix together, and they become aware of each other. And located as it is on the trade route and near a pilgrimage spot, it becomes a very important center for the distribution of texts. And so this is one way we can see these scribal centers moving up in Erzinga, and then we see by the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the school of Glajor and then Tatev coming into prominence. So as the economy sort of shifts eastward, or at least as there's a resurrection in the economic situation in the east and an increase of trade along both east-west and north-south, we can see also intellectual life moving towards Greater Armenia as well. And of course, with the collapse of the Cilician kingdom in 1375, it left Syunik in a very good, strong position to take over intellectually. We can see where all the students came from that studied. If we look at the students who came to Tatev and studied with Tat'ewac'i, we can see that they came from all over the dispersion. From Crimea, from Tiflis, of course from Syunik and Artsakh, from Cilicia, from Tabriz, and from Dadon and Kajberonik. So from all over the Armenian dispersion, students came to study at Tatev. Again, they brought their traditions with them, right? But more importantly, they then went out afterwards. They were sent out afterwards to take up positions, sometimes back in their hometown. So they brought the Glajor-Tat'ew tradition with them wherever they went, and were able to spread that tradition. And so we can see the formation of a network of people, basically what we would call today an alumni association, of people from Tatev who were connected to Grigor Tat'ewac'i in particular, but also to the school, the Glajor-Tat'ew tradition, now spread around. And so we have this network based on a tight teacher-disciple relationship and based upon alumni. And it achieved a degree of centralization. As you're aware, unlike the Latin Church, the Armenian Church does not have monastic orders. Right? There's no Dominican order, Jesuit order, right, where there's a head of the order that dictates it. Every monastery had its own rule. Every monastery did what it wanted. Advantages to that, but there are also disadvantages to that. This sort of solved the problem. Even though there was there was nothing written saying Tatev is the head of this order. If Grigor Tat'ewac'i was your teacher, and there are 20 of you that they've staffed at various monasteries throughout Syunik and throughout Kajberonik and in Tiflis and Tabriz, you're all connected. And you all are following what's going on at Tatev. And so it achieved this degree, a degree of centralization through a tightening of this network. And this allowed, creating this idea of having a center, at Syunik, at Tatev, periphery model, also allowed manuscripts to be produced and disseminated much more quickly. Okay? And this is also a big deal, because the more you're able to get your stuff out there, right, the more dominant it becomes. And so, for example, we know of the Gjirkat's in addition to the autograph. I think there are about 8 or 9 copies, I think it's 8, that we know that are still in existence that were copied in Grigor Tat'ewac'i's lifetime. That's very rare to have that many copied in somebody's lifetime. And it says Arvoten Grigor Tat'ewac'i at the feet, at his feet, so that he checked them. He checked these copies. We know at least 4 of them were done at Tatev itself. And this is an interesting idea, because in the past, we know from the medieval West, we know from the Latin, from medieval Europe, the longest period of time it takes to get a copy of a manuscript was the original ordering of it. That is the way it normally was done. And the way manuscripts were normally produced was, if you were in monastery A and somebody was in monastery B, the person in monastery A says, oh, I want a copy of Thomas Aquinas' work. You have to shop around to see who has it. Then you have to send a request. Then it has to be copied and brought back, or you bring your copy back. And the greatest amount of time, the actual copying could go very quickly. But getting to the monastery to make the initial request could take time. Right? This model, however, seems to imply that, no, we're going to make several copies here and distribute them out. That is, I know you're going to need this text because you're my student. So we're going to make another copy of it, and you're going to take it with you. Okay? And this means that you have a wider distribution much more quickly of these texts. Okay? And it's not, therefore, by accident that after biblical manuscripts, Tat'ewac'i's texts are the second most numerous that we have. Right? His Kados Girk is probably the most numerous, and after that is the Gjirkat's. There are over 100 copies of the Gjirkat's, right, in manuscripts, either partial or complete copy. A huge number for Armenian manuscripts. All right? So this seems to have worked for him as well. Okay, modernization. Let's get to the punch word here. What do I mean by modernization? Completely inappropriate for the 14th century, early 15th century. However, I think we can see some aspects of what Grigor Tat'ewac'i does that applies to our own modern situation. First of all, we can see a drive towards standardization. We can see this in the shut-up notes, and we can see this in the ritual of Artapet. Right? We can also see it with the doctrine, this idea of standardizing. Everybody has to have the same thing. Okay? And that makes it easier. Right? The second one, ease of access, again with easier. Something that's very key. I mean, these are still problems, right? This is the whole thing of the internet. We need a standardized code, and we want to make things accessible to everybody. We want a standardized tagging system, and we want to make everything accessible to people. This is what he's worried about. We need a standardized system so that everybody can easily access what it means to be an Armenian Christian. Not, oh, this is what my monastery does, and this is what his monastery does, and that's what they do over there. No. What do we do as a community? Right? Very clear, very simple. So the organization of his work, as well as his manuscript production. Let's get more stuff out there as fast as possible, right? Makes it easier to access for the community. And integration. Right? This is the other thing. How, again, in a globalized world, how do we deal with all these different ways of thinking, all these different ways of doing things? We have a problem of integrating, of creating a system of thought that is easily understandable. And this is what he does with Latin teaching and Latin methodologies. Right? He integrates it into the Armenian system. Of course, he Armenizes it. In a way, it's no longer Latin because he's recontextualized it within an Armenian intellectual tradition. But nonetheless, he's able to successfully integrate it without causing a rupture. This is very difficult. It's not easy to be able to look at somebody else's tradition and say, okay, I see where they're going with it, I see how I disagree with it, but I also see where we can use something here and be able to incorporate it into your own tradition. Right? So he's able to do that. And increased efficiency in communication. Right? Again, something we're still very obsessed with. Right? And we can see this here with that intellectual network that he sets by sending his students out, by bringing in people from all over. And I think that is a result of his own travels throughout the region. He realizes that the Armenian world is a large one. It's not a local one, it's a global one, or a regional one, at least for him. And he needs to be able to communicate to everybody outside. And I think all of these reasons are also why his students compare him to Christ. Right? Not just like, oh, he's a great teacher, yeah, he's an easy A, or something like that. No. This is somebody who understood the problems Armenians were facing at the time and came up with innovative ways of solving them. And it's not an easy thing to do, particularly in the circumstances of when he did it. The other thing is that his work still bridges the medieval and modern periods. And I sort of, again, made reference to this, but the Shadak notes, the ritual for Vartavet, they're still with us to this day. The Grigor Tat'ewac'i is still with us to this day. But more importantly, it remained, you know, the standard theological textbook in many respects from his time all the way through the 18th century. And I said his books were published in 1729, the Grigor Tat'ewac'i, 1729-1730, by Hovhannes Golod, who was the patriarch of Constantinople. He himself had come from Bahesh, from Bitlis. Okay? And Bitlis, the monastery of Amardogu, was the successor, the intellectual sort of descendant of Tatev. So we can sort of trace the students where they go. They go from Tatev, and then the center sort of moves eventually to Amardogu and Bitlis, and then from Bitlis it moves to Constantinople. And so that tradition in some ways does bridge, right, the medieval period of Syunik, of Tatev, of Glajor, and then it ends itself in Constantinople with the publishing work of Hovhannes Golod, which makes it accessible to everyone else. What this means for the Armenian Church today, you know, this is a vexing question. I mean, obviously, the Armenian Church today, as every church today, finds itself in a precarious situation. And I think it's because we, as a global world, I mean, as a world, and we as Christians, and we as the Armenian Church, are in a period of transition. And we don't know where it's going. I mean, there have been a lot of changes that have happened very recently. The fall of communism, the independence of the Republic of Armenia, all the way through to the disaster that's going on in Syria at the moment, to the secularization of the world, to the globalization, the connectivity that we have through the internet, that is providing challenges, I think, for every institution, whether it be governmental or whether it be spiritual, but particularly spiritual. I think spiritual institutions in this empirical age are having trouble finding a new footing. However, I do think in this sense, Tat'ewac'i does provide some hope, because it's still a hell of a lot better than it was in 1370. It's still a lot better than having Tamerlane and his sons rampaging through your town and slaughtering people. It's still better than not having a state at all, another one, you know, having just been taken by the Mamluks, and being in complete disarray. And in that sense, yes, I think we are in a period of transition, and I think the church, under the right leadership, and following some of the examples maybe that Tat'ewac'i had there, accessibility, communication, ease of access, right? In terms of creating a network of people in which to build itself around. It'll take some time, but being able to do that and showing that love and devotion that he really had, not just for his faith, but also for his students and for his followers, and to really take the whole issue personally. And I think that's what really made the difference with him, is that this was not just a job for him. This was not, it wasn't even just a vocation, a calling. Right? This is really personal and struck to the very heart of who he was. And because of that, he was able to extend, because of his passion, his drive, his dedication, he was able to extend his vision of what it meant to be an Armenian Christian to a much wider population than otherwise would have been. And managed, I think, in some ways to keep the Armenian tradition together for the next several centuries. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't go on too long.